my real passion is looking at how do we help children develop healthy relationships with their body. And one of the best places to do that, of course, is in the school context. So prior to becoming an academic, I had lots of roles, one of which was promotion prevention specialist for the province, eating disorder coordinator for the province. I was also a family therapist for an eating disorder program. So I bring practice experience to our conversation here today, but I think one of the reasons that I'm most excited about speaking with you today is that I think teachers have enormous potential to influence how a child develops the relationship with their body. And so I'm really excited to be here today to talk to you about why not weight in schools. Okay, so weight in schools is actually a contested construct. It's quite a complex thing. It's not a simple sort of equation that we need to look at. When we talk about weight in schools, we need to consider the context that we're in, the educational setting that we're in. And teachers sometimes find this topic of conversation a little bit contested or confused or complex. So here are some of the questions that actually teachers have asked me over the years. I actually think there are evidence-based, wise answers to all of these questions. And today we're going to talk about how do we wisely address the issue of weight in school contexts. So the guiding question this week is why not weight? As I've already mentioned, this is really not a simple construct. Weight itself is a contested construct in social discourses, in research, in how we talk about it. But instead of me telling you about that, what I'd like to do is show you a video that demonstrates how complex the idea of weight is.
Increased caloric intake, decreased amount of energy expenditure, leading to obesity.
More than half of teenage girls are or think they should be on diets.
It's about genetics, it's about diet, it's about exercise, and the interaction between all those three things.
And a new study from Harvard Medical School shows that many of them are picking up body images issues from a surprising source, their moms.
We're seeing increasing rates of obesity of a significant degree in children, not just preteens, but also younger children. And a child who is obese as a teenager has a 70% chance of being obese for the rest of their lives.
surprising, I guess, that men are also susceptible to peer pressure and what they see out in the culture that says this is the perfect look for you, just like women.
I don't like my weight.
Really?
Yeah, most of my girls in my grade are really slim, like they're tiny, and I'm bigger than them. I don't see myself as big, but I see myself as like right in the middle.
Right.
And I want to be skinny.
Every day until the day I graduated, I was picked on and ridiculed about being overweight, being fat. I was eating whenever I was sad, upset, especially when I came home from school and after being picked on all day. That's really when it escalated.
When you have culture that's wrapped around food and eating, and that becomes part of the overlie in your particular group, then that's a big issue.
Women aren't alone when it comes to worrying about body image. A recent study of male college students shows the more music videos and primetime TV men watch, the worse they feel about their body.
The way we live our lives also has contributed dramatically.
Maybe we have scared families about being outside, and I think in terms of safety, particularly stranger fears of children being abducted.
We obviously drive places where we used to walk. We build communities without sidewalks. We have stairwells that are not designed to walk up and down. They're not lighted.
They're doing what we ask them to do when they sit in front of that TV and computer game all day. No matter what words come out of our mouths, our actions are suggesting to them that nature is in the past. It's not really important anymore. The future is in electronics, and the boogeyman lives in the woods. So these kids are following orders.
It's the cultural, the social, the emotional factors involved, and the comforting factors involved in how we eat and how we use food in our environment.
Watching your weight is not an action, it's an anxiety.
But we're in the throes of a child health crisis with child obesity.
It's the cultural, the social, the emotional factors involved.
And it's a very, very complex interaction.
So as you can see from the video that was actually produced by some graduate students of a colleague of mine in Toronto a number of years ago, the factors that we need to consider when understanding weight are quite complex, and there are, of course, it's multidimensional. So as we set you up for the case study work you're going to do in lab today, I'd like to start with 3 assumptions that we're going to work from as we proceed. So these assumptions are supported by the literature, they're supported by research. And the first assumption is that schools are not immune from the public discourses about obesity. So we've all heard the media coverage about the childhood obesity epidemic, all sorts of discussions around that over the last few years. But in the face of all these discourses about the childhood obesity epidemic, what we sometimes forget is that there's typical normal development. So the focus on the physiological consequences of obesity has led to what some researchers are calling Fad Mania. And in the face of this Fad Mania, what it doesn't get so much prominence is that there's typical normal development. And children oftentimes go through a weight spurt before they go through a height spurt. And if we interfere unnecessarily with children's normal development, what we can actually do is set them up for a lifetime of a difficult relationship with their body, a relationship that can include eating disorders. So we need to round out the discussion and the coverage that there is around the obesity epidemic with some of the psychosocial, emotional, cultural factors that are also at play in terms of how we understand this story or this narrative around the obesity epidemic. The second assumption that we're working from today is that schools are not immune to the public discourses about eating disorders. So there are so many programs and shows and coverage about weight loss, extreme weight loss programs, that they've coined a term called fadertainment to capture all those things. So The Biggest Loser is probably the most famous program of this nature, but there's The Last 10 Pounds, Village on a Diet, I think are some Canadian kinds of examples of these kinds of programs that are on TV. So some people argue that good TV, I actually think whether or not this is good TV is a whole nother debate we could take up, but what might be argued as good TV is certainly not accurate science. And so all of these imperatives that we get from this show around eating well, exercising regularly, monitoring our bodies, carry powerful moral overtones about what it means to be a good citizen in the world. And the message really is thinner is better, thinner is healthier, thinner is the good citizen in the world. So whether the messages are from TV programs around extreme weight loss or whether they're on social media, thinner is targeted as the ideal, that your life is going to be happier and that you're going to be healthier if you're thinner. And we know that this is not good science. So it's fundamental that teachers be informed by a broad spectrum of weight-related issues, which leads me to my next assumption, is that obesity and eating disorders are related and relevant. Now, I in no way expect you to understand this yet another framework, but this is a model of best fit that I developed when I was asked to do a systematic literature review for the Public Health Association of Canada. And the reason I talk to you here about is because I get to tell you that I had to look at 759 articles for this literature review. Not that I remember. 131 of them made it into the systematic literature review. What is relevant for you today? This systematic literature review was looking at mental health and mental illness in childhood obesity. But this is relevant across obesity and eating disorders. What's most important for you to look at is the notion of weight-based teasing and concern with weight and shape. These are constructs, ideas. These are things you will see happening in your school. And it's related both to obesity and to eating disorders. And arguably, it's related to mental health as well, which we will get to in a moment. So why as a teacher is this important? This is important because you will work with children of all shapes and sizes when you're working in schools. You will see a variety of students in terms of their size, their shape, their sense of their body, their weight and shape concern. I can guarantee you, you will run into a variety of students in your career. So my main interest isn't just about the extreme end of what might be considered a continuum, obesity and eating disorders, but my main interest is what lies in between. So what leads to the development of these issues with children and youth? And how can teachers be influencers in a way that increases the probability that a child will develop a healthy relationship with their body? So eating disorders are very rare, But the risk and protective factors that contribute to the development of these disorders are factors that teachers can have influence on. So in the common discourses, in the social discourses that we see around weight, there's often this sense that there's a war on weight, that we somehow need to fight the weight in our bodies. And there's not a lot of data about negative effects of this, but there is a story I want to share with you about a research that took place in Singapore, because I think it's really relevant. So in Singapore, they noticed that there was an increased rate of children being classified as overweight and or obese. And they decided as a school system that they needed to do something about that. And so they created what they called the Trim and Fit program. Now in the Trim and Fit program, what they did is they went into schools and they identified weighing and measuring the students in schools. And if the body mass index calculation came at the score that the child was classified as overweight or obese, they were mandated to go to an after-school program where they were exercised. Now this program was touted this huge success because the rates of overweight and obese reduced during that time. A couple years later, our research went and looked at the case files for admissions into eating disorder programs during that period of time. And what they discovered was that 11% of children who were admitted to hospital for anorexia nervosa, now I also want you to keep in mind 11% might not sound like a lot, but people who are being admitted into hospital for eating disorders are the most severe in terms of their medical and psychological complications. So 11% is actually pretty startling. So they went to interview these 11% of children who were now in an eating disorder program, and 50% of those children actually identified being picked out for the Trim and Fit program as as the straw that broke the camel's back, so to speak, in terms of the development of their eating disorder. Now, I'm sure that the school boards didn't go in thinking, I know what we're going to do, we're going to harm some children today. No, they had the best intentions. They created these programs thinking that they were helping children. But it's very important that we consider the complexity of weight when we're trying to do things that in the name of health and in the name of helping children. Similarly, in Canada recently, there's a report out of the Sick Children's Hospital in Toronto where they have been able to anecdotally understand when doctors' offices are focusing more on obesity prevention programs, and when schools have obesity prevention programs coming into their schools, they can predict that the number of people who come to the Sick Children's Hospital into the eating disorder program will increase in that area. So again, it's anecdotal, but we need to be very careful about how we're approaching these issues and do it in a very thoughtful way. So let's talk about some of the risk factors that are common across an entire spectrum of eating disorders. So the first risk, we're going to talk about all 5 of these. The first one I want to talk about might be the most robust risk factor for the development of both eating disorders and obesity, and that is dieting. Okay? So we actually know through cross-sectional as well as longitudinal evidence that dieting actually predicts weight gain. Okay? So when we look at a sample of 14-year-old girls and we understand what kind of practices they're doing at the age of 14 to restrict their food intake to try to lose weight, the more weight loss strategies that a 14-year-old girl is practicing at the age of 14, the more likely she is to be classified as overweight or obese when she's 24. And in all of these studies, we've controlled for things like initial body mass index, onset of puberty, social economic status. So we've controlled for the other factors that could explain that relationship. So that's just an example of one study, but there's lots of studies that would conclude that dieting actually predicts weight gain. That weight I lost, I found it. So diets don't work. Okay? There's lots of reasons for that. So for example, when you diet, what you're actually losing usually is muscle mass. and body fat, and what you gain it back as is body fat, and body fat takes up 6 times more space on your body than muscle does. So if you actually want to take up more space in the world, you should go on a diet. But perhaps even more important than the fact that diets don't work is that there's ample evidence now to suggest that weight cycling, or yo-yo dieting, going on and off diets, is actually worse for your health than simply maintaining a weight that might be considered above average or above normal. So despite mounting evidence that indicates that diets don't work, A, and B, that dieting and yo-yo dieting is bad for your health, there remains a $60 billion per year dieting industry in Canada. So the message I send about dieting in schools and to teachers is do not diet, and that is an evidence-based recommendation. There are still all sorts of discourses about what it means to be a good citizen in the world. And so every holiday season, there tends to be this big debate about Santa. So there's one course of people who are saying, Santa shouldn't be a role model because Santa's fat. Santa needs to lose weight. And there's another course of people saying, let Santa be fat. Okay, I actually think both of those things miss the point. The point is that Santa can go around the world in one night. Like, is this not an attribute that maybe counts more importantly than the size of his body? So we need to increase what we count as important for people. The next risk factor that I want to tell you about is media internalization. So we know on average, an adolescent spends about 9 hours a day on a screen, which I really have a hard time understanding because that's more than a full-time job. Adults are actually exposed to about 600 advertisements a day. So there's been a strong evidence of an association between body mass index and the amount of screen time. We actually know if we can just reduce the amount of screen time a child is spending on a screen, we can actually improve their health scores if we do nothing else but reduce the amount of time they're looking at a screen. And media, of course, has long been a potential risk factor for the development of eating disorders, for women because of the thin ideal, and increasingly for men because of the muscular ideal. But the reality is that the vast majority of people are not born with the genetic predisposition to meet any of the ideals that we see in the media. I remember seeing Cindy Crawford, who's now old and decrepit, and you've probably never even heard of her, but she was a famous model when I was young. I remember seeing her being interviewed once, and she was really upset. She said, you know, it's really hard for me to look in the mirror in the morning because I don't even look like I look in the magazines. And I really tried to feel sorry for her, but I couldn't. But the square peg is never going to fit in the round hole, yet we're sold all sorts of goods and promises that if we buy certain things or do certain things, that somehow we'll be able to contort our bodies to fit into these ideals. And then, of course, there's this dress if you'd like to purchase it. So there's a whole anorexia-inspired fashion. So this dress is $2,500. You can order it on the internet if you'd like. The copy that goes with this dress is, so you can find a garment that will create protruding bones if you don't have them, or accentuate them to your best advantage if you do. For $2,500, this is yours. So media representations of ideals is controversial. One famous quote by a doctor, in fact, from the UK, goes something like, this is not an exact quote, it's a paraphrase, with the obesity epidemic, a few anorexics are a small price to pay. The third risk factor I want to talk about is body image, and specifically body dissatisfaction. So we know that body dissatisfaction is actually a causal risk factor for the development and maintenance of disordered eating. And we know body image itself is quite complex. I could give a 2-day workshop on body image. It's multifactorial. There's lots of things that go into body image. But let's look at the kinds of body image ideals that children and youth come across. So this is Steffi. Now, Steffi is a close relative of Barbie, but Zellers has fewer lawyers than Mattel. So I use Steffi. So if Steffi were real, she would be 7 feet 2 inches tall. She would have the measurements 38, 18, 28. For her 7 foot 2 inch frame, she'd have a size 3 foot. that is perpetually pointed. She also wouldn't actually be able to stand up because her bust is too large to be supported by the size of her waist. So if she actually stood up, she would break in half. She simply wouldn't be able to exist. So gender expectations play a role, obviously, in the ideals that we set for males and females in our culture. And younger girls are being taught that being skinny and being pretty and being sexy is somehow more important than caring or play or friendship or intelligence. But we can no longer leave boys out of the equation. Because boys, the ideal for men is becoming more and more impossibly muscular. And what I want to point out here on this slide is that G.I. Joe's bicep in 1998 was the same size as Steffi's waist. So these proportions are so unrealistic. Now, some people say, you know what, they're just toys. Kids, you know, that's not a big deal. But there are implicit messages about what it means to be a man and what it means to be a woman and what it means to be male, what it means to be female in our culture that are perpetuated by these kinds of toys. So usually girls' toys are about a girl being ornamental, right? It's about how she looks. It's about changing Barbie's clothes and doing her hair. And I don't know, did Barbie ever have a job? I'm not sure. Oh, many jobs, right, yes. But how she looked at those jobs was pretty important in terms of what you could buy for her. And for boys, oftentimes the toys send this message that boys are supposed to be instrumental, right? It's about what they do, how much they make, how much space they take up in the world. These messages are implicit. Now, this is a toy that you can purchase at an RS catalog near you. But is weightlifting really appropriate for a toddler? Okay. Children are meant to run and play and socialize in organic ways. They move their bodies just naturally. And I would argue that they don't need child-sized styrofoam toys to work out. What we're doing is we're putting upon children an adult preoccupation with manipulating our bodies when they will very naturally play and move around. The fourth risk factor I want to talk about is self-esteem. So self-esteem is, of course, one's overall judgment of their overall worth. And we know that children who have high self-esteem tend to have a more accurate reflection of themselves. They know what their strengths and what their limitations are. They tend to generally be more satisfied with themselves and have a sense of overall self-acceptance. And children with low self-esteem generally are more critical of themselves. They're at greater risk for developing a negative body image. Now, having a good self-esteem doesn't mean that you love every single part of yourself. If there were body part stores like auto part stores, you in fact might line up to trade in a part or two, but overall, you feel pretty happy with how you are in the world. So this has long been one of my favorite slides. What matters most is how you see yourself. So there's some research to suggest that in fact, feeling fat might actually be more important than being fat in terms of the psychosocial, psychological outcomes of children. So there have been a number of studies done that show actually, regardless of weight status, when a child feels bad about their bodies, they tend to engage in more risk behaviors, regardless of their actual body size. If they feel fat, that tends to be psychologically more damaging than actually being fat, regardless of body size. And we also know from some studies, some prospective studies and longitudinal studies over 10 years, that feeling satisfied with your body is actually not a risk factor for the development of eating disorders and obesity, but feeling satisfied with your body over a 10-year prospective study actually predicted healthy weight. Okay? So making someone feel okay about their body isn't going to make them complacent. What studies actually show is that helping someone feel like their body is worth taking care of actually predicts healthy behaviors and healthy weights over time. So you will come across children and youth who have weight and shape concern, which is a preoccupation with body weight, body size, body shape. Now, generally speaking, overweight, children who are classified as overweight or obese tend to have more weight and shape concern than children who are classified as normal or underweight, at least in our culture. And girls also tend to report, more than boys, a general sense of weight and shape concern. And we know that weight and shape concern is associated with psychological distress, depression, body dissatisfaction, regardless of the child's actual body size. So here are some public health campaigns that took place in Atlanta, Georgia a few years ago. I'm wondering if anyone has any responses to these advertisements. Make anyone uncomfortable? Yeah. What message is this sending about children? So to me, it's pretty concerning. Even the posture of the children in these public health campaigns show that, overweight and obese children, at least ones that are classified that way, are somehow defensive or unhappy or maybe don't deserve a happy childhood. There's also an assumption here that somehow it's very individually focused, that somehow it's the child or the family's problem or issue that these children are classified in a certain way. So this was a pretty controversial public health campaign, but this campaign was actually on billboards and passed through the public health authority in a state without anybody recognizing the explicit and implicit weight bias messages that these advertisements were making, all in the name of the health of children. So we know that weight bias manifests in schools most often as weight-based teasing. And weight stigma can be subtle, it can be verbal, it can be physical. So name calling, it can actually involve abusive things, like one child reported that people used to stick pins in her to see if she would pop. Relational victimization, so being excluded or being rumored about. And of course, there's internalized weight bias. We all live in a culture where there's fat mania and where thinness is the cult of thinness. And so oftentimes people who live in large bodies and then are on the receiving end of weight stigma actually feel they deserve that kind of treatment. Now, it's not just peer victimization happening in schools, and I'm not just picking on educators because I could put up slides here of every single health professional. We know that professionals also have weight bias. So parents and teachers are pretty important role models in terms of influencing children's attitudes about their weight, but unfortunately teachers' attitudes towards weight, particularly towards children who are classified as obese, may have harmful effects on how children develop a relationship with their body, on their body image. Oftentimes we have lots of data that physical education teachers' attitudes towards children who live in large bodies is a real barrier to them enjoying movement at all in the school or in gym class. Commonplace things in schools like talking about healthy weights or healthy eating often take place in a school without consideration for the diversity of body sizes that are in your classroom and in your school. So why should, as a teacher, we care about weight bias in schools? Well, we know that being on the receiving end of weight bias and stigma can actually trigger anxiety, depression, low self-esteem, body dissatisfaction, and even suicidal thoughts and actions. And we also know that being on the receiving end of weight bias actually compromises our ability to take up health-promoting behaviors. So there's a common kind of notion in our discourses that, well, you know what, that person is fat, and if they just knew they were fat, maybe they would do something about it. So I'm going to tell them that they're fat, and then maybe that will motivate them to take action to not be fat anymore. But what we actually know from psychological literature is that when we shame somebody, or when we are trying to activate behavior change when someone feels bad about themselves, they're way less likely to be able to practice health-modifying behaviors if they feel like they're not worth doing those behaviors for. So shaming someone into behavior change is not an effective strategy. So we should care about weight bias in schools because it fosters blame and intolerance. it really affects the quality of life of children. In fact, one study actually showed, when they looked at a comparison between children with cancer and children who received weight stigma, the children who were teased about their weight actually reported less quality of life than the children who were struggling with cancer. It impacts multiple domains of living, and it has serious medical and emotional effects. So in fact, some of the associations that we make with obesity are actually accounted for by weight bias. So we sometimes see correlations between mental health and obesity. What we're starting to discover and understand is that the anxiety, depression, low self-esteem, body dissatisfaction that we might actually be seeing in people who live in larger bodies is more likely associated with being on the receiving end of weight stigma than it is actually with the size of their body. So just what is happening in educational settings? So I probably receive about 100 calls a year to consult on practices that are taking place in schools. And some of these stories, I think, are sort of common practices and easy fixes, and some of them, I think, are sort of these perpetual kinds of practices that are happening in schools that remain unexamined. So let's look at body mass index report cards. So body mass index report cards are mandated in some states, in some provinces. These practices are taking place in our schools across Canada and in our schools in Alberta. So children are weighed and measured in schools, their body mass index is calculated, and then a report card that might be called a BMI report card, or it might be disguised as a fitness gram, or it might be called something else, but essentially what is sent home is a passing or failing grade for the student on their body. Now this is often done in the context of not at all preparing for what kind of resources are available if a child fails their BMI report card test, and oftentimes can also result in, if the child is not safe at home, they get a failing grade on a BMI report card, they're even less safe at home. Now, even when body mass index measurement is done in schools with best practices, and best practices might be, for example, a school nurse is taking height and weight along with other measurements in a private place with one child at a time, even when that is done, a study in Alberta actually indicated that about 16% of those children reported feeling very uncomfortable and very shamed about that experience. So there's still 16% of children who, even when it was done in best practice, just did not feel comfortable with that. But more often than not, what I hear about is not best practice taking place in schools, but rather a scale set up in a gym for public weighing and measuring, where girls are applauded for low weights and boys are applauded for high weights, kind of Biggest Loser style. Another practice that I've often consulted about is the 6-minute mile. So, or is it the 10-minute mile? I don't know, which is more possible? Anyone? 10-minute mile? I don't know. Okay, let's say it's the 10-minute mile. Okay, so I got a call from a parent from a grade 6 student whose phys ed teacher had decided that in order for the class to pass their phys ed grade, they had to be able to run the mile in under 10 minutes. Now, the child who came home and reported this to his mom actually was able to run the mile in under 10 minutes the first time he tried it, but he was very concerned about a couple of his friends who were unable to do that the first time they tried it, and the rest of the class was just standing around doing nothing, waiting for these students to cross the finish line. And he could see that they felt quite shamed about it. So I think there's some problems with that practice in general. I ended up talking to the phys ed teacher, and he told me that he was helping children not to be fat, and that any student who wasn't able to run the mile in under 10 minutes would be doing it again the following week, and they would be doing it every week until they could do it in under 10 minutes, and the other students would not be moving, just waiting for everyone to be able to accomplish that. Now, I'm not sure what actually changes in a week. The child will just be more motivated to run or more shamed into running. I'm not sure how this practice helps students develop a lifelong relationship with moving their bodies. In fact, I would argue that it does just the opposite. Another practice that I've consulted on very recently actually is called the beep test. Oh, there's reactions to that. Okay, so I'm not a kinesiologist. I don't really understand the beep test a whole lot. What I do understand is that the beep test is an evidence-based way of measuring cardiovascular health. Okay, so students are timed and they're meant to run in between lines in a timed fashion, because there's a beep every time they're supposed to run. And I guess people drop out. If you don't make the line by the time the beep goes, your test is done. Now, grade 7 class went to their gym teacher and said, I feel pretty uncomfortable running the gym test in front of the boys. Could we run the beep test maybe separately? Or now I have a concern with the beep test in a junior high gym class in general, because I can understand doing the beep test for, you know, an after-school sports team but I'm not sure how a beep test helps children develop a lifelong relationship with moving their body again. So I just wonder if sometimes there is appropriate places for these kinds of tests to be taking place, and I'm not sure a junior high phys ed class is the best place for a what the beep test. And these kinds of practices in educational settings don't just end in K-12. So in the United States, at a university called Lincoln University, which I believe is in Pennsylvania, in 2009, they decided that they really needed to do something about the obesity epidemic. And so what they decided was that students were not allowed to graduate with their degree unless they had a normal body mass index. So all fresh people were weighed and measured when they came to university. If their body mass index was classified as overweight or obese, they had to take these 2 courses that would try to help them reduce their body mass index, and they weren't allowed to graduate with their degree or certificate until they had reduced their body mass index to normal. Now, this of course created quite a lot of controversy, particularly when the first cohort of people got to graduation time, and there were a number of honors students and people that were told that they couldn't graduate. It also got the wellness center going a little bit, because some of the people that received the letter that said that they weren't allowed to graduate because their BMI was not normal were also people that were going to the wellness center for eating disorders. So again, I'm sure that the board of directors there, or whoever decided that that was a good idea, didn't think to themselves, I know what we're going to do. We're going to hurt some students today. But these practices are taking place in the name of health, and we really need to think about the complexities when we are implementing practices or policies in schools that can affect all students. So here are some guidelines for eating disorder and obesity education in schools. First, don't discuss specific eating disorders. What the research tells us is that when we go into classrooms and we talk about the signs and the symptoms and the causes and the consequences of eating disorders, what actually happens in that classroom is, at best, nothing. It does nothing. At worst, what it does, it actually increases the risky behaviors of some of the students in that classroom. So when we have a limited amount of time to address health and wellness, and particularly mental health in schools, there's much more utility in talking about skill building, problem solving, healthy relationships, self-esteem, positive body image, some of the risk and protective factors that actually have impact in multiple domains, rather than a student being able to define what a diagnostic criteria for something is. Oftentimes it's presented in ways that glamorizes practices that are disordered eating, and the teenage brain cannot process those in ways that are helpful to them. We also want to never assume that a child who is overweight or obese or classified, who lives in a larger body, we can never assume that they are unaware of their status. They are reminded on a daily basis that they don't fit in. You can't hide your overweight or obesity. That's something that's out in the open. That is the body you carry. So you can't hide your status. So don't assume they don't know. They're reminded on a daily basis, sometimes in cruel and unusual ways, that their bodies don't fit. We also need to assess our own behaviors and attitudes around weight, around body, around obesity. And we need to consider more environmental and systemic practices that will create the context where everybody fits, where everybody belongs. We cannot blame the child. We don't know what's going on in that child's life. And as you saw in the beginning video, factors that contribute to someone's body size are very complex. It's not as simple as energy in, energy out. Something else you can do is you can be really careful about the types of resources that you choose in your classroom. There are plenty of weight-biased resources out there, like Meggy Goes on a Diet. Now, I refuse to buy this book because I don't want to give the author any money, but the synopsis of it goes something like this. Meggy lives in a large body. She's teased every day at school. A teacher intervenes, and she goes on a diet. She stops eating bread and cheese. She joins the soccer team. She loses weight. She gets all sorts of friends. Happy ever after. There are better books than that. This book called Your Body is Awesome talks about how everybody fits, how all bodies are different, how there's room for everybody. What else can you do as a future teacher? You can choose your imagery. You can choose what kinds of posters, and you can choose to create an environment that shows that you are accepting of all different body sizes and shapes, of diversities that include body size and shape. There's some really great books here. Full Mouse, Empty Mouse is actually quite a complex book. It would be great for a junior high school. Shapesville is maybe a little young, but for upper elementary would work. We also need to reflect on our school environment. So I often get calls from parents whose children decided that they didn't want to participate in sports anymore in junior high, high school, because of the types of uniforms that they're forced to wear during competition. So oftentimes I hear about the volleyball underwear that girls have to basically wear underwear on the court. And oftentimes that's a barrier for their participation in the sport. Now, as a person who's not educated in kinesiology, what I notice about sport when I watch the Olympics or when I watch elite athletes is that there are all different kinds of body shapes and sizes. And there seems to be certain bodies that tend to be good at certain sports. But what I also notice when I watch the Olympics is that female athletes are often talked about in terms of how they look or what they're wearing during sport, and not at all about their athletic prowess. We also want to consider the desks, like even the desks in this theater. Are these desks welcoming to people of all shapes and sizes? Do desks have arms on them? Are the desks in your classroom movable? Is the space in your environment welcoming regardless of the type of body that your student has? So connect with your students. This is a common message across all of our conversations, I think, is that students of all shapes and sizes need to feel a sense of belonging and a sense of connection to at least one adult in the school. They need to feel like they belong in the school. So as teachers, I think sometimes, just like everybody, we default to complimenting our students on something easy, like their appearance. But my daughter, who is 14, received a compliment from her language arts teacher, and her language arts teacher said to her, "You are a good writer." Now, my daughter tried to deflect that because that's what we're supposed to do in our culture. But I know that that sat deeply with her. Writing is important to her, and for her teacher to tell her she is a good writer, this is something she now carries with her. It's meaningful, it's important. It's not about how she looks. right? And I've noticed since she received that compliment from her teacher that she spends more time investing in her writing. She loves to write. Someone noticed. That's much more meaningful. So I want you to think about, just close your eyes if you're comfortable for 1 sec, close your eyes and think about the teacher or mentor who had the most positive impact in your life, who may or may not be one of the reasons why you decided to become a teacher. Okay? Now, when I close my eyes and I think of that person or those people who influenced my life in a positive way, it's not because of how they looked or that they cared about how I looked. What are some of the reasons that that person comes to mind for you? Why is that person, why is that teacher or that mentor important to you? Yes?
Confidence in your ability or my ability.
Right, so they noticed you, they had confidence in something that you could do. They made you feel special, that you had something to offer, that you were worthwhile. Right? Did it have anything to do with how that particular teacher looked? No. So as we've talked about, good intentions might actually contribute to weight issues. So when we're creating healthy school communities, there are certain things that just should not happen in schools. And the first is we just need to stop focusing on weight, period, full stop. Weight has no place in schools. So discussing healthy weights doesn't need to happen in schools. Weighing children in schools certainly does not need to happen. Now, I received a phone call from a parent of a kindergarten student whose kindergarten teacher had decided that for growth and development it was a really good idea that she weigh and measure her students and then put their heights and weights on the wall under a title that was called Weight Watchers. Well, I'm so glad you responded that way. Sometimes people are like, yeah, so. So this is problematic, right? There are some problematic practices. Now, when we had a discussion with that teacher was not intending to send messages about dieting or monitoring your weight, or that teacher was intending to focus on growth and development, but just hadn't considered the complexities. We also need to watch our school resources. There are plenty of school resources, traditional ones, that really are quite weight biased in terms of how they present an ideal protagonist. But here are some things we can start. So we can start inviting teachers to consider their own personal assumptions about body size and shape and weight. We can emphasize health and quality of life rather than weight. We can train teachers in the area of health and wellness, which is why I'm pretty excited to be here today. And we can expand comprehensive health programming to include more than just healthy eating and physical activity, but to also focus on positive mental well-being and how all of those things are connected. We really need to move away from oversimplified policies that really are equating eat less and move more to somehow being an equation that adds up to health. And we must create a sense of belonging for students of all shapes and sizes. So weight is not a behavior. Oftentimes we think of weight as something we can modify, but in fact, weight is not a behavior. We can eat more fruits and vegetables and move our body more. Those are behaviors that are measurable. But weight is not a behavior, and it should not be a target for behavior modification. We need to consider our environment. We need to target policy and systems change. We need to seek to eliminate weight-biased messages and resources. So, for example, our desks, our chairs, the gym uniforms, where is gym taking place? And we need to include body and weight-related teasing in policies on bullying. So when I talk to in-service teachers, they often tell me that one of the last forms of acceptable stigma in their schools that take place is weight-based teasing. Okay? So we need to begin to include body size and shape as one of those diversities that teachers are going to protect, because everybody belongs, everybody has a place. So weight is distracting in schools. Weight has no place in schools. I hope in your labs this afternoon, when you take up a case study around this, you'll be able to find ways to just switch the messages just a little bit, where we can focus on the health promoting behavior of children of all shapes and sizes. So my dream is to live in a world where all the time and energy and resources that we trick people into spending on trying to manipulate their body in some way is actually spent on trying to make the world a better place, actually trying to make a difference in the world, in focusing on things that really matter, that are really meaningful. It's a lofty goal, but I think it's possible. And part of the reason that I began advocating to have this course mandatory for all Bachelor of Education students is that I believe teachers have the potential to have an enormous impact on how a child develops a relationship with their bodies and with themselves. Enormous influence. I'd invite you to read out loud with me the next quote. "And I said to my body softly, I want to be your friend. It took a long breath and reply, I've been waiting my whole life for this.